In 1923, two neighbors in Weimar Germany lived through one of the most brutal hyperinflations in history. One was a concert pianist with 15 years of training and recordings sold across Europe. The other was a plumber who learned his trade at 16. As the economy disintegrated, the pianist was reduced to begging for bread, while the plumber continued to eat 3 meals a day. Most people view this as a story about blue-collar versus white-collar work, but it is actually a lesson in economic hierarchy. Conventional belief says that more education and higher credentials provide a safer floor during economic storms. However, 70 years of economic autopsies show that every collapse in recorded history inverts that hierarchy. Doctors drive taxis, engineers wash cars, and PhDs trade cigarettes for potatoes. Buried deep in labor market forensics from Weimar Germany to modern-day Venezuela, the skills that actually survive are those that function independent of the institutions that usually support them. The first law of collapse economics is the repair economy. In December 2001, Argentina defaulted on $93 billion in sovereign debt, the largest default in history at the time. Middle-class families who previously traded in their cars every 3 years suddenly needed those same vehicles to last another decade. A mechanic who could keep a 1995 Renault running for another 100,000 kilometers was no longer just a worker, he was essential infrastructure. Data from the Argentine crisis confirms that while formal employment in finance and professional services collapsed, skilled trades like mechanics and metalworkers saw their employment hold. In some cases, real wages in the informal economy actually increased because the supply of skilled repair labor contracted faster than the demand. Repair skills are anti-fragile. They invert the economic cycle. The worse things get, the more broken things accumulate, and the more valuable the repairman becomes. Another survival skill rarely mentioned in textbooks is monetary translation. Every economic collapse creates a dual monetary reality: the official system, which is dying and state-enforced, and the real system, which is informal and adaptive. The gap between them is where fortunes are made and lost. During Lebanon's currency collapse from 1919 to 2023, the Lebanese pound lost nearly all its value, and the banking system froze. However, informal currency exchange brokers, known as sarraf operators, continued to function. They were the capillaries of the economy when the arteries had hardened. People who understood how to facilitate exchange between a dying currency and a stable store of value, such as the US dollar or commodities, became indispensable. When a currency collapses, the official price signal is destroyed. Humans still need to buy food and pay rent, and they desperately need someone who can translate between the dying signal and the emerging one. The third pillar of resilience is knowledge that cannot be inflated away, specifically the knowledge of food production. In 1992, 8 months after the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia faced inflation of over 2,000%. Despite this, Russia did not experience a famine. This was largely because 71% of Russian households had a dacha, a small plot of land. By 1992, these tiny plots were producing over half of the country's meat, milk, and vegetables. It wasn't just the ownership of land that saved these families, it was the preserved knowledge of how to plant, harvest, and preserve food without chemical inputs or industrial supply chains. You cannot confiscate agricultural knowledge, and you cannot freeze a bank account that holds fermentation or cold storage skills. In any collapse scenario, households with active food production knowledge demonstrate significantly higher resilience because they are less exposed to food price inflation and less dependent on currency stability. The final survival skill is medical knowledge that scales when institutions fail. During Cuba's special period in the 1990s, the Cuban economy lost 80% of its imports and the formal economy froze. Physicians found themselves in hospitals with no anesthetics, no antibiotics, and no electricity. The institutional system that transformed their medical credentials into healing had vanished. 10,000 Cuban doctors chose to drive taxis instead. This highlights the central paradox of credential-based skills. The more institutional infrastructure a skill requires, the more vulnerable it is. A medical degree often requires a functioning hospital. A law degree requires functioning courts. However, underlying medical knowledge, the ability to suture wounds, manage infections with basic antiseptics, and recognize nutritional deficiencies without imaging equipment, retains extraordinary value. The practitioners who thrived were those who could adapt their knowledge to the absence of institutions. The common thread among all these skills is modularity. In economic evolution, the systems most likely to survive shocks are not the most sophisticated, but the most modular, those that can decouple from the larger system and continue to function independently. Your credentials are often institutionally dependent. They are derivatives whose value is tied to the system that conferred them. If that system fails, the credential evaporates. A skill that addresses a fundamental human need directly is the underlying asset. This is why in every recession and financial crisis, skilled trades maintain employment at higher rates than knowledge-based occupations. A plumber does not need a functioning securities market to fix a pipe, but a financial analyst does. Looking forward, this historical lesson becomes even more critical. With the rise of AI, many entry-level white-collar positions face technological displacement even in stable conditions. The credential-dependent worker is threatened by both automation in good times and institutional failure in bad. The most resilient portfolio of human capital is one that retains exchange value across the widest range of conditions. History teaches us that when institutions fail and credentials evaporate, economic dignity is retained by those who can provide for fundamental human needs. The real question is not which skills are recession-proof, but which skills are institution-proof. From Russian dacha farmers to Lebanese currency brokers, the answer has remained the same for 2,000 years.